Good morning, everyone. My name is Khaled Elgindy. I'm Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington. I'd like to welcome everybody to this special event. This week, as you know, is the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And it's been a kind of an interesting, from a both academic and analytical point of view, it's been an interesting 50 years. A lot of things have changed, yet a lot of things have not. The changes have, of course, covered or included all sides to the conflict. When you look back after 50 years, certainly all the efforts that have been spent to try to end the occupation of Israel of the West Bank and Gaza has not necessarily totally ended or produced a political solution to the Palestine problem. And the occupation continues today and doesn't look like there are any signs, in spite of the administration's threat to embark on a peace process in the region again. It doesn't look as a very promising premise, if you will, to either side. I mean, both sides have welcomed the announcement by the president. They seem intrigued by his commitment to personally be involved, but they are not necessarily very hopeful. And that, of course, is reflected in public opinion in the region when you have, I think, the most recent surveys I've looked at, almost 78% on the Israeli side and more than 60% on the Palestinian side, do not seem to be impressed or hopeful that these steps will succeed in bringing an end to the occupation. The question that we've chose for our speakers today, what next for Palestine and the Palestinians? I think it behooves us as a center and as people interested in both the Middle East in general and the Arab-Israeli conflict to ask at this time, as the administration, as I mentioned, is embarking on a new initiative as to what's next. Of course, we know over the past 50 years, the Palestinians have failed to create or come up with the successful strategy to end the occupation or to enhance the implementation of their right to self-determination. Israel has created facts on the ground that, for those of us who do frequent the region, are fully aware that basically the concept of two-state has become virtually impossible, practically speaking, in terms of the changes on the ground, particularly in the West Bank, in terms of settlements, the number of settlements, the location of settlements, and the number of settlers. It would be very impossible to create a reasonable political solution based on the concept of the two-state solution at this time. Israel has sank also deeper and deeper into the cesspool of occupation. I think it's becoming also difficult for Israel itself to extricate itself out of the kind of intoxication, if you will, of control over the territories. And the remarks that we keep hearing from the current government of Netanyahu are not only contradictory in terms of his commitments and the commitments of his government, but in terms of willingness to even endorse the very concept of a peaceful solution with the Palestinians on the basis of exchange of land for peace and the two-state solution. So with that in mind, we have a great panel here today that will be introduced by my colleague. I just wanted to welcome you and kind of introduce the subject matter. And Dr. Yusuf Munayyer, my friend and colleague from the center, who also chairs or is executive director of the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights in this country, will introduce the panel and our distinguished speakers today. Welcome again. Yusuf.
Thank you very much, Khalil. It's great to be here with everyone and have this opportunity to reflect on this important question We are in the middle of 2017 at this 50th anniversary of the 1967 war, but 2017 is also important as a marker for a number of other reasons that I think are relevant to the question. 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, 70 years since the 1947 partition plan and the beginning of the Nakba, 50 years, of course, since the 1967 occupation began, 35 years since the massacres at Sabra and Shatila, 10 years since the beginning of the tightening of the siege on the Gaza Strip. And so I think this is a very appropriate moment for us to reflect on what next for Palestine and the Palestinians in the broader sense of the question as well. And I'm delighted to be joined by this very distinguished panel. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will present, and I will just briefly identify them. You could find the entirety of their bios in the packet for this event, so please do check that out. Professor Virginia Tilley, who is Professor of Political Science at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale and co-author of the UN ESCWA report on Israel of March 2017. She will be discussing the state of civil and human rights in Palestine and the contents of the ESCWA report and the events surrounding its release and retraction. Khaled Elgindy is a fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings Institution and a former advisor to the Palestinian leadership on negotiations. We'll be discussing prospects for Palestinian statehood, the end of the Israeli occupation, and a just resolution to the Palestine question. Nadia Hijab is co-founder and executive director of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. She will discuss the role of the international community and options for a just solution to the Palestine question. And last but not least, Professor Bill Quandt is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia and a former member of the National Security Council in the Nixon and Carter administrations involved in the Middle East peace negotiations. He will be discussing an assessment of the Trump administration's policy towards Palestine and the policy challenges and recommendations that can bring an end to the Israeli occupation. With that, I will turn it over to the panel and just remind you that once we are done with presentations, we will have a question and answer session, and you will see that there are note cards on all of your chairs. So please do submit any questions that you have so we can take as many as possible at the end of the event. With that, Professor Tilley.
Oh, thank you very much. With apologies to the program organizers, I didn't actually get the description of what I was supposed to talk about until I'd already written something else. So I'm going to share with you what I prepared, which moves on into the implications of the report that we did for the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for West Asia. We are at the 50th anniversary, and this does really compel us to reassess our approach to this conflict. We are really looking, I believe, at a paradigm shift. And in the paper that I've written for the center, I cite these things, so I'm not going to bother citing them aloud. This remains technically a belligerent occupation. International law calls it that, and it is that. And we need to keep that on the table because to move away from that would implicitly authorize Israel to acquire territory by war, which contradicts international law. But it is also clearly an annexation strategy. We don't anticipate the withdrawal of the settlements. And I wrote a book on this way back in 2005, which I mentioned not to plug the book, but just to say that this has been clear for some time, that Israel had no intention of withdrawing these settlements, that they are part of an annexation strategy. And we have to grapple with that. We can't ignore that. We can't pretend that that's going to be reversed. The finding that we were asked, or the study we were asked to do by the United Nations Commission was to ask whether what Israel is doing in the regarding the Palestinian people as a whole amounts to a regime of apartheid. And with apologies to you, partly because the executive summary is in your packet, I will not go over those findings again, except to note that the findings were about Israeli policies now. They're not about something coming down the road. They are an observation of Israeli policies and practices as they manifest today. It seems to me, and this is, and to Dr. Falk, Richard Falk, with whom I had the honor of writing this report, that the implications of this report are profound. And it's those implications that I want to go over. A finding of apartheid immediately indicates that the international community is required to stop that practice. International law says that it is a state responsibility to do so. Upon a finding, say, by the ICJ, confirming our findings, that would then come onto the table. Our findings were that when you look at Israeli policy within the Green Line and in the occupied territories, Jerusalem, and in regard to refugees, in those four categories, we see a complementary system whereby Israel is seeking the core aim of the definition of apartheid, which is the preservation of Israel as a Jewish state. The core aim, just to mention briefly, is the definition of apartheid in international law is inhuman acts and policies for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. There's a lot in there, which again is in the report, and which I won't go over now, because I'm focusing on the implications of that finding. The implications for our purposes here have to do with the two-state solution. And it becomes clear upon looking at these findings, which rather wrote themselves when you look at Israeli policies, is that it would sustain rather than resolve this apartheid arrangement. And since apartheid is a formula for conflict, the conflict will therefore continue. I'm going to run through these quite quickly, and I hope you can follow my logic, and of course, in questions, we can clarify anything that isn't clear immediately. First of all, a two-state solution would clearly preserve apartheid in one of the two states. We intuitively can draw on the precedent of the South Africa case to grasp this idea that the solution to apartheid in South Africa was never that the white apartheid regime would sustain apartheid in some portion of South Africa and the rest of it would be somehow consigned to Bantu or black peoples. It was clear that apartheid should be eliminated whole cloth. In this case, though, Israel is committed to remaining a Jewish state. And creating a state of Palestine allows this by transferring responsibility for Palestinian political rights to that other entity, to some state of Palestine. All agree that in such an event of two states, economic union would be essential to the viability of the solution. This goes back to findings by British commissions in the 1930s, right through the GA Resolution 181, which called for partition with economic union. That was the plan that was actually proposed. It's often forgotten that that was an essential part of that resolution. But open borders of that kind to enable the functioning of two states that are intertwined in this small area of land is something that Israel cannot tolerate. The reason it can't tolerate it is because the mixture of populations in such a setting would tend to undermine the Jewishness of the state. Therefore, a truly sovereign Palestinian state is not on Israel's agenda. And much of the material that I wrote for the center for this event tried to clarify the extent to which the Bantustan policy of South Africa is replicated in the Oslo Accords. It's replicated to a point where I have a hypothesis that Ariel Sharon was, we know that he was in South Africa during those preceding years, and we know from people in South Africa that he was asking about the Bantustans every time he went. And I can't document that properly, so I'm sharing it with you here orally, but I think what we see here is that especially the 1995 Accord replicates the Bantustan system, which, we should remember, allowed lip service to self-determination. The idea was that the white nation, the white people, would have their own state, and the Bantu peoples, as defined by the white regime, would have their own states, and with everyone having the right to self-determination, all would be well, justice would be served. This, of course, was not accepted by the ANC or its allied organizations, and it was not accepted by the international community because it was seen, and indeed was frankly admitted to be, by the regime, by the apartheid regime, what they called grand apartheid. It was the final solution, not meaning to stretch the meaning of that term too far, but it was their final solution to the problem of sharing a state across racial borders. One thing that the grand apartheid strategy therefore had to grapple with was to make these so-called independent black states, or Bantu states as they called them, homelands, compliant with the white regime's interests. And here we see a striking similarity between what in South Africa was called the Bantu self-government authorities, quote unquote, and the Palestinian Interim Self-Government Authority, same exact name, and the way that those were set up by constitutions that were written by the white regime to ensure their compliance. The compliance meant principally that Israel would tolerate no Palestinian leadership, Bantu leadership, and we see this also in Israel-Palestine, will tolerate no leadership that breaks with the state's edicts and security needs as the state interprets them. We see this in the outcome of the Oslo Accords in that Israel has not allowed any leadership to come to the fore that would do so, that would break with Israel's edicts and security needs as Israel interprets them. As it did for the Bantu Self-Government Authority in the South African homelands, the Palestinian Interim Self-Government Authorities, its authority is confined to civil affairs and the repression of dissent, of Palestinian dissent. In both settings, the homeland's leadership was made contingent on its cooperation with the white government, with the apartheid government, to ensure security, political oppression, and economic stagnation. It's a bit of an aside, but not entirely irrelevant, that the Abbas group running the Palestinian Authority from Ramallah is illegal according to Palestinian basic law, as well as the terms of the Oslo Accords. The PISCA is supposed to be elected, and it was not elected. The Hamas party was elected, and it was not tolerated. It was overthrown. That's food for thought in helping us understand the extent to which Israel is making itself the arbiter of Palestinian leadership. In this setting, where Israel is absolutely committed to maintaining itself as a Jewish state, pursuing a Palestinian state as a way to recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination will perpetuate Israel's system of apartheid rule. Deprived of meaningful sovereignty, trapped within walls and fences controlled by the Israeli military, unable to escape crippling limits on movement and trade, and unable to forward or maintain a national leadership that would reject this doomed package. Such a state would indeed comprise the bottle within which, according to Raphael's famous aphorism, Palestinians will crawl around like drugged cockroaches. We actually thought that was simply a racist thing to say at the time, but it's become rather literally, I don't mean the cockroaches are literal, but I mean it's become much more clear what is Eitan meant by that the geographic arrangements for Palestinian autonomy would be such that the Palestinians would have no options and would be deprived of any meaningful political capacity to change the situation. The outcome of such a Palestinian state, therefore, a two-state solution with a Bantu-stan state, is not a stable peace. It is mass revolution or mass emigration or both. How's my time?
2 minutes.
Oh. In the paper that I gave to the center, I took this a little further into more, I would call, fragile ground, that when we look at the entire history of the conflict and we go back to the beginning of the mandate period, we do find that Palestine, as it has been drawn out geographically, was supposed to belong to all who lived in it, which is, for those of you familiar with the South African case, the famous line from the Freedom Charter and much promoted by the ANC and its allied parties, that the country belonged to all who live in it. Self-determination by Bantus was seen as a ploy by the apartheid government to sustain itself. I hesitate to say this because it flies in the face of so much that has gone down and for which so many people have sacrificed their safety and their lives in some cases. But the entire analysis here of a Bantustan state taking form in the territory of Mandate Palestine suggests that peoplehood may need to be reassessed. The Zionist movement was based on the idea that Jews form a people of their own. This removed from Palestinian nationalism Jewishness. And I wonder what we may find if we explore the idea that this be rejected and that the situation be redefined as one of one country, one people, wrongfully divided by a racist doctrine. I realize I just opened this up to a lot of rapidly scribbled comments here, but when we're talking about a one-state solution, we have to begin to think our way out of the box, where the ultimate fulfillment of the rights of the people involved are met by reconceptualizing the conflict from the ground up. I do not think it is tenable to continue after 50 years with the premises that have guided it so far. That has become clear. The understanding of it is one divided by these four categories, where Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians living in the occupied territories, Palestinian refugees, and Palestinians in Jerusalem are all treated as separate categories. Has to stop. It all has to be seen as part of one policy, and the solution has to build from there. I encourage you to read the paper that I submitted to get a little bit more of the feeling of these rather radical suggestions. But with that, I'll stop for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tilley. With that, I'll ask Khaled to begin.
Excuse me. Thank you, Yusuf, and thank you, Khalid, for inviting me this morning. The anniversary of the 1967 war, I think, is an opportunity to reflect on where we are and how we got here. When I look back at the last 50 years or more, I'm struck by the similarities between today and not necessarily the period around or of 1967 war, but actually the eve of the 1967 war. And if you'll indulge me for a minute, as I kind of retrace some of those parallels, specifically with regard to the political, diplomatic, ideological inertia and vacuums that exist, I think are very similar to the period just before 1967. The sense of Israeli complacency and comfort with the status quo. We have a Palestinian leadership vacuum. There was in May of 1967 a PLO, but it was not truly independent and not truly representative yet at that point. And I think we have a very similar sort of Palestinian leadership today. Its legitimacy, its representativeness, its independence are all in, in question. Most importantly, the terms of reference of the peace process, the basic rules of the game, as we've known them for the past 50 years, are collapsing or have collapsed entirely. Some of you may recall that before 242 and 338, there was 181 and 194, UN General Assembly resolutions. First, the partition resolution, and 194 in response to the war and the dispossession of Palestinians. Those two were, for the international community and for the United States, the two basic pillars of the peace process as it was known then. 1967, of course, wiped the slate clean and changed all of that. And I would argue that the same process has been happening with regard to these terms of reference that we've known since 1967. UN Resolution 242, in which is enshrined the land for peace formula. The occupation itself is in question and very often denied by not insignificant sectors in both Israeli and American politics, and more so over time. And of course, we are facing the very real possibility of the collapse of the two-state solution itself as a result. Some of you may recall even during the most recent negotiating round with Secretary Kerry, American negotiators were talking about the situation. They would use the term, they would say, there are no terms of reference for these negotiations. That's why we can't arrive at a framework. And the framework was going to be the terms of reference. To my mind, that was one of the most striking proofs, really, of the erosion of the existing terms of reference. As such, I see the current reality as raising two pressing questions for which I think there are no easy answers, and I'm not going to propose answers, but I would like to use them to kind of frame my talk. Can the current conditions in which we have eroding terms of reference, a declining Palestinian leadership, a diplomatic vacuum, can they be restored or must they simply be replaced, as happened after 1967? And the second pressing question is, can we do so proactively or voluntarily, or must we wait for a catastrophe, a very high cost to be paid, such as happened after 1967? I don't have the answers, but I agree wholeheartedly with Professor Tilley that we need a paradigm shift in how we approach this conflict. We need specifically to begin looking at alternatives, not just to a two-state solution, but especially within a two-state solution. The classic two-state solution model, a la the Clinton parameters of traditional partition, is, in my view, most likely dead. Thanks in very large measure to the very successful settlement enterprise and international and American complacency and acquiescence in it. As a result of facts on the ground, I think it is no longer possible to, quote, unscramble the egg. But at the same time, I think that the more central causes are, in fact, political. As I mentioned, the terms of reference have been eroded or have collapsed. But also what have always been very precarious political consensuses around a two-state solution among Palestinians, among Israelis, and in the United States, and for that matter, the Arab world and the international community, is also collapsing. And you know, the idea of partition was never the best option. I think it was always seen by both sides as the less bad option, as the least worst, if, you know, pardon my grammar. Partition has always been preferred, I think, because of the clarity that it affords. Clear borders, divided sovereignty, and so on. But if we look back at the experience of the last century, it has consistently failed for at least 80 years. From the 1937 Peel Commission to the 1947 UN Partition Plan, 2000 Camp David and Taba negotiations, Annapolis, and of course the most recent Kerry negotiations. At the same time, I think a one-state solution that envisions a binational state in which all of the people within from the river to the sea enjoy equal rights, while certainly noble and something that I wholeheartedly support in theory, I think is not yet politically viable. It has almost no support in Israel. The strongest support, from what I can tell, appears to be among Palestinians, mainly in the diaspora. And Fatah, of course, has staked its political future on a two-state solution. And even Hamas has sort of come along. It has hedged, but it has accepted the idea of partition on a certain level, that it is willing to accept a state within the 1967 borders. The bottom line, I think, is that there are currently no serious political actors, parties, or movements, either on the Israeli or the Palestinian side, that are currently advocating or organizing for a one-state solution. And to me, that means it's not politically, hasn't come online yet politically. The reality that we have on the ground also is one that is neither one state nor two, as we heard from Professor Tilley. And I think rather than simply imagine a future where we can radically reinvent this reality from one in which there is a clear sense of shared destiny in one form or another, both Israelis and Palestinians in their historical national narratives look at the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea as their singular, indivisible homeland. And I think this is one of the issues that has made partition so difficult. So I think we need to reconsider how we look at a two-state solution, specifically in terms of confederal models. And by that, I mean those where sovereignty is shared or blurred, or the relationship between sovereignty and citizenship is not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. There are many historical precedents in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Even classic partition models are not as clear-cut as we might imagine. They contain elements of both. The 1947 partition plan, as was already mentioned, called for economic union. And Israel was, lest we forget, declared and recognized essentially as a binational state, in the sense that almost half of the population under its 1947 partition plan borders were Arabs. And so there was at least an acceptance in theory of binationalism on a certain level. From 1948 to 1966, we have a precedent of transitioning from military rule to enfranchisement. I think it's not an insignificant example. In 2000, we have examples at Camp David in which ideas for long-term lease of land in the Jordan Valley and elsewhere, Palestinians proposed models for an open city in Jerusalem where there would be shared sovereignty on some level. And of course, the idea of qualified sovereignty is sort of built into the peace process itself. In 2008, For example, the Annapolis negotiations, Palestinians proposed residency rights for some Israeli settlers as a way to create new options. And so I think if we're going to move forward, we need to reimagine a two-state solution beyond simply hard borders and absolute separation. I think separation is separation without, on a very inequitable basis, of course, would be something akin to apartheid, if not apartheid itself. And so we can't simply separate. And I would argue also that the current reality of a Palestinian Authority operating under indefinite Israeli occupation is itself already a hybrid or a mixed model, albeit a very inequitable one. And so some of the advantages of looking at the confederal model that I see is that it addresses, I think more honestly, the dilemma of these competing narratives where both sides see in one form or another all of the land as their natural homeland. It offers more creative solutions to some of the more intractable issues raised by partitions, such as the refugees, settlements, and problems with divided Jerusalem. And I think very importantly, can help mitigate and bridge the vast power asymmetry much better than either a two-state solution or an imagined one-state ideal. So instead of forcing the weaker side to accept the ideological narrative, for example, of the powerful, instead forcing the weaker side to accept the ideological narrative of the more powerful side, as was the case during the Kerry negotiations and the so-called Jewish state issue in 2014. A confederal model would allow for each side to retain its own national narratives. Of course, there are some serious drawbacks. I think it is obvious that it would be much more complicated to negotiate. There are many more moving parts, if you will, and it assumes a much greater level of trust and goodwill on the part of the two sides than currently exists. This is, I think, the real Achilles heel of confederal models, is that it requires a very serious change in mindset. That's not to say it's not possible. We also have a mixed record of confederal models in other contexts, in Belgium, the Balkans, and elsewhere. But I do think that we need to at least to start thinking beyond the strict partition and separation models. Instead of pretending that we can either convince Israelis to give up the most important parts of Jerusalem or the biblical heartland on the one hand, or to grant 4.5 million Palestinians the right to vote on the other, I think we need to look at ways to reimagine the current reality in a much more equitable and sustainable basis. If we do not, my fear is that the more we insist on framing the choice as a binary between the practical failure of partition, of two-state solution, and the idealistic notion of a one-state solution, the more people, I think, will naturally gravitate toward binationalism. It is one that it is inherently more just, and I think is more logical that people would naturally gravitate toward it. We may also have to think to reconsider the old terms of reference, including UN Resolution 242, in favor of a new paradigm that addresses the actual needs of the parties. So, for example, and I'm just throwing this out as an example, instead of land for peace, we may want to look at the notion of rights for security, a sort of broader paradigm, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khaled. Nadia?
Okay. Well, gosh, I actually, I'm not going to speak about solutions, because I was asked to really look at the role of the international community. add the options for a just solution, but having looked at it, I couldn't see any immediate options for a solution. And just to say that when we talk about the international community, we tend to think of the state system and ignore other actors, but in this case, in most cases, civil society is a key player, and in this case, I think even more so in the quest for a just peace. So I'm going to review the roles of both state and civil society. I think really, as Virginia and Khaled have noted, that today we face a moment of truth, not just because of Israel's prolonged occupation, but certainly related to it. I think Russia's invasion, occupation of the Crimea has sharpened minds regarding the core principle of international relation, about which was picked up, also set out in UN Security Council Resolution 242 about the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by war. The election of Donald Trump so soon after Britain's Brexit vote, and the impetus of burgeoning right-wing populism in the US and Europe has also sharpened minds, especially in the European Union. Trump's America First attitude, which was very much on display during the G7 summit, his position on NATO, his pulling out of the climate agreement, is driving the EU to realize that it really has to rely on itself, as Angela Merkel recently declared. The notion that we might have at some stage a strong and independent EU that upholds the rule of law without the increasingly pro-Israel UK government, current UK government may change on June 8, serving as the US Trojan horse in the EU, is potentially a positive development for the Palestinian people, but only much further down the line. It will take time for new alliances to form and for the dust to settle. In addition, Israel has formed very strong ties with individual EU states that can still serve as mini Trojan horses and that can help it push its agenda in that system. But I think most of all, the EU faces that moment of truth. Israel has made it impossible, as has been said, to turn a blind eye to its plans for annexation of most or all of the occupied territory. And the right-wing settler movement is by now so strong and so determined to legalize the occupation. A recent example being the bill to retroactively legalize illegal posts on private Palestinian land, that it may even torpedo a US effort to foster Netanyahu's dream of a truncated, non-sovereign Palestinian entity where Israel maintains full security control, despite the promise of normal relations with much of the Arab Gulf. If US and Netanyahu can swing a deal that leaves the settlers free to settle, but without the clear legal imprimatur they want, which is that it is all Israel, including the Golan Heights, then the EU must decide as to whether it's going to continue to turn a blind eye to what's going on and buy the charade of a deal imposed by an occupying power on an occupied people, and risk seeing it replicated in the Crimea, or will it uphold the position set out in UN Security Council 2334 in December and call on all states to really distinguish their dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied in '67. So far, the signals have not been good. Israel still reaping away the rewards of occupation without paying any meaningful price. And the EU's attempt to hold Israel accountable by labeling settlement products has been found to have a non-existent impact. And in any case, is a very far cry from the real distinction that you would need to make between the settlements funded and supported by Israel's government and its financial sector and the violations of the rights of the Palestinian people. So that's on the economic front. As regards a political cost, it's maybe enough to note that the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, has just been elected one of the deputy presidents of the UNGA for this coming year by the Western European and other group. That a UN member in such flagrant violation of the organization's rules and resolutions should be able to serve in this position, and it's not the first time. Unfortunately, speaks volumes about the capacity of the so-called international community to bring about a just peace. So this is where civil society comes in. But before moving to the role of civil society, I focused primarily on Europe because in the near future, I feel that it's where governments are likely to take a position in support of international law. The same can't be said with respect to the rest of the international community. The US will be in turmoil, but pro-Israel through the rest of this administration. Canada and Australia are out. The Arab world experiences severe fragmentation, and several Arab countries can't wait to normalize relations with Israel. And using the Iranian bogeyman. And I think the campaign we're seeing against Qatar is in the last few days, which helps Israel turn the screws on Hamas and Hezbollah, and increases its possibility of doing a deal on Palestine on its terms, is a sign of what we're seeing. I really have to say that even though, I hate to say this, but you really have to hand it to Israel. It really, even though it's the strongest country in the region and one of the militarily strongest in the world, it works 24/7 to advance its agenda and take advantage of every opportunity. It's reestablished its relations with most of Africa, developed strong relations with India, taken advantage of the right turn in Latin America to expand military and diplomatic ties. So this then is the simple task facing Palestinian and global civil society, which is how to push back against this relentless Israeli juggernaut and to convince the international community that its best interests are served by upholding the system of law that they established to protect humanity from horrific endless war that could not destroy not just the human race, but also the planet itself. And I have to say, you really have to be insane to be trying to do this work. However, luckily, many of us are. And equally importantly, many thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands by now, are doing this work for Palestinian rights at all levels. And equally importantly, I think it's important to note that Palestinian and global civil society has in recent years become increasingly strategic. Perhaps the most strategic was the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions in 2005, which really sparked a huge response from civil society worldwide, including churches, trade unions, and which has achieved successes with major international organizations, with business ties in Israel, with actors, football players, bans from going to Israel, while it's in violation of Palestinian rights, which really impacts the public image. But beyond these successes, I think the strategic impact of the BDS movement is twofold, really. One is that it defines Palestinian rights in a way that apply to all, the entire Palestinian people. And two is that it delegitimizes not Israel, because actually the BDS call recognizes Israel, albeit implicitly. It delegitimizes Israel's occupation, its racism against the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and its continued exclusion of Palestinian rights. So Israel has, of course, pushed back. You probably know this better than I do. The most potent weapons it's using is conflating any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and promoting legislation here in the United States, state by state, and at the federal level, as well as promoting it in Europe. Set against this pushback is that some of the most powerful critics of Israel are Jews. And they're now too well organized, strong, and numerous, I think, in my view, to be disbanded. And of course, they can't be accused of being anti-Semitic as easily as you can accuse everybody else. And more global civil society is better organized than at any time in the past, both here in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere, and has staffed professional organizations. This is quite a shift in the approach to the past, handling different areas. But in addition, all of Israel's strengths really can't compensate for the major weakness that underpins its whole enterprise, a weakness that is self-inflicted. Its determination to hold on to the occupied territories and to physically uproot the Palestinians using a range of really heartbreaking ways is increasingly drawing attention to the injustice at the heart of the Zionist project itself. and the way in which the creation of Israel could only be accomplished through the deliberate erasure of Palestine and the disposition and dispersal of its people. And many activists, including especially many Jews, are now beginning to question not only the occupation, they've moved on, but, and its associated practices, but also the Zionist project itself, thus going to the root of the conflict. And it's worth noting, I think, because it was just so dramatic, that the main plenary at this April's biannual Conference of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is the largest and most strategic organization in the global solidarity movement, that opening plenary, the main plenary, was entitled, "Let's Talk About Zionism." And it was a deliberate pushback against Israel's attempts to conflate anti-Israel positions and anti-Zionist positions with anti-Semitism, which is a hateful creed. And this was not just a conference panel. It was the launch of a study of year and debate within JVP to take a position on Zionism. So this is, I think, quite a tectonic shift that we're seeing within that broader movement. And just to really give us all hope in order to continue to work for justice, I think these are just some of the longer-term trends. There are others like alliances by movements for racial, economic, and environmental justice that are being galvanized through other forces that will, in fact, undermine Israel's colonial project in the longer term. So while the battle for justice is far from won, it is certainly not lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Bill?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. I've been given a kind of impossible task to try to figure out what's going on inside President Trump's mind. It scares me to think of being there. Also, Nadia basically gave my paper in one sentence and said, don't count on Trump to do anything constructive. And that's my conclusion, but I want to take a few minutes to get to how I get there. I think it's pretty clear this far into the Trump administration that this is not a president, nor does he have people around him who are thinking in large, analytical, strategic ways about, as far as I can tell, any part of the world, but certainly not the Middle East. That doesn't mean they don't have certain inclinations and perhaps predispositions, but it's hard to, at this point, say they've got clear-cut policies. We wouldn't be necessarily surprised on many issues if 2 months from now something different came along, because there is a certain amount of fluidity caused by the chaos that reigns. But we have a few clues to look at in terms of where are at least the starting points and where are the predispositions. And they come largely from Trump's own mouth or from his Twitter feed, and since I don't read tweets, I depend on my wife, Helena Cobbin, to tell me what crazy things, or reading about them in the paper. But there are bits and pieces of, you can call them raw material to work with, including some statements that the president has made since he has become president. But during his campaign, when he was pretty free in expressing his views on all kinds of things that he didn't know anything about, he did say some things that were pretty interesting. I mean, obviously he had very strong pro-Israeli commitments, but what else is new during a presidential campaign? So did all the other Republican candidates and all the other candidates, except the only sane one who, on these issues, was Bernie Sanders, the only Jewish candidate amongst them. It was kind of an interesting statement about American politics. But Trump himself took the standard positions of, we're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, which he hasn't actually yet done. But toward the rest of the region, there was a kind of, I'm not going to be like Obama, or, he didn't say it quite this way necessarily, but, or like George W. Bush. I'm not going to get the United States as bogged down in the affairs of the Middle East because my priority is America first. So the war in Iraq, he was quite forthright in criticizing. During the campaign, at least, he implied that he had no real problem with Arab dictators and all this stuff about democratization and human rights and international law. But these were all kind of secondary issues at best, and as far as he was concerned, dealing with Hafiz al-Assad, or Bashar al-Assad was just fine, Sisi was just fine. Stability was much more important than either democratization or necessarily peace process. So this was quite a different sound to what typically other candidates would say, who would say, oh, we're for peace process and two-state solution and all the rest. When it came to Israel-Palestine, Trump was almost kind of amusing in the way he positioned himself. He said, I'd really, really like to tackle this problem because it's supposed to be a really hard deal to make, and I'm a great deal maker, and this would sort of prove my chops. I don't think any American president has ever justified peacemaking by showing, what a great deal maker it would make him feel. But that, I think, is intrinsic to the way he looks at this. People tell me this is hard. People tell me it's impossible. Therefore, let's give it a try. It's kind of a trivial way of getting yourself into the frame of mind to tackle this problem, but it does seem to be one of his motives. Another thing that he said that got some attention, I hasn't said it so recently, and again, it's kind of intriguing, and if he really meant it, it could be kind of interesting. He said, I don't particularly care whether there's a one-state solution or a two-state solution. No other American politician had said that. I'm not sure he knew what the meanings of these things were, but it was kind of, he said, I'm willing to accept whatever they can agree upon, which in principle sounds reasonable. I actually agree with that myself. If Israelis and Palestinians could get their acts together and say, here's what we agree on, it's called a 2.5+1 solution, and that's what we've come up with, I'd say, fine, great, doesn't matter to me. 1, 2, 3, and in that sense, I was kind of thought, this shows a kind of open-mindedness or an empty-mindedness. The problem is, of course, that if the Israelis and Palestinians could so easily agree on a 1, 2, or 3-state solution, it would have been done by now. Or if it were close to being done, they wouldn't necessarily need an American mediator. They could just do it. I mean, it's not that Israelis and Palestinians don't talk to each other. They do. And if they really were close to an agreement, and they just needed a little side payments and reassurances, there are plenty of people who would join the game and say, if you need some economic development aid when this is all over, or you need some security assistance when it's all over, or if you need a big international conference to make it look kosher, that's fine. We can do all of that. But there's no distinctive role for the United States if they're really all that close. The distinctive role for the United States, if there were to be a genuine peace process, is to put pressure on the Israelis to do things that they are otherwise not prepared to do. And that is the only reason, in my mind, that year after year after year, Arab regimes and Palestinian leaders have wanted the United States to be in the game because they think it would bring to bear possible pressure on Israel. Now, by now, it is many, many years into this business, and we may as well conclude it's not going to happen. I worked for President Carter. I think if he'd been reelected, it might have happened. His inclinations were to try to do something. If the first President Bush, with James Baker as his Secretary of State, had been reelected, I think he might have tried to do something. But honestly, since then, I don't think we've had a president who understood that the unique and very, very difficult role for the United States in this game is to put pressure on Israel while also perhaps giving them some reassurances. And if you're not prepared to do that, you're not really playing the game in a serious way. So what I conclude is that what's missing in all of this is that there is no strategic thinking going on about this part of the Middle East. There may be, although I think it's misguided, about the Gulf and about Iran and about Saudi Arabia. You get the impressions that that's being put together as a kind of policy, the results of which we may be seeing right now. But on Israel-Palestine, I don't see it. Let me give you an example of what I would be interested in hearing from this administration as an example of strategic thinking. I'm going to read you a quote. And if you haven't already read this paper, I want you to try to guess who I'm quoting from. This is from 2011. Lack of progress toward a comprehensive Middle East peace affects U.S. and CENTCOM security interests in the region. I believe the only reliable path to lasting peace in this region is a viable two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. The issue is one of many that is exploited by our adversaries in the region, and it is used as a recruiting tool for extremist groups. The lack of progress also creates friction with regional partners and creates political challenges for advancing our interests by marginalizing moderate voices in the region. By contrast, substantive progress on the peace process would improve CENTCOM's opportunity to work with our regional partners to support multilateral security efforts. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's an example of strategic thinking. You link peace process to other developments in the region, and you say, this is why it's important for our national interests. Now, who do you think said that? No, but close. Mattis, when he was head of CENTCOM. He was testifying before a congressional committee. He is now, of course, our Secretary of Defense, but I have not heard a single word like that out of this administration, including from James Mattis. So I don't think we have a strategic framework yet if we're thinking about this. The only issues on which the Trump administration seems to be getting its rhetoric and its policies kind of coordinated is on being anti-Iranian, which I guess we could have assumed from the campaign rhetoric, the attack on the Iran nuclear deal, but it has been ramped up quite significantly, and the appointments of key personnel in the Defense Department, McMaster himself at the National Security Council, Tillerson, Pompeo at CIA, all of these people are on the record as being very, very strongly anti-Iran. So I think that is a real feature of the new policy and quite different from Obama's attempt to open some doors to Iran. I don't know what the consequences will be when we will have to rethink that policy, but for now I'd say that's a pretty strong part of the current policy. And the embrace of Saudi Arabia and the UAE as our special partners in the Middle East, and maybe add Egypt as a third partner in this kind of Sunni Arab leading campaign against Iran's influence in the region. Now, does this mean that the Sunni Arab partners could say to Trump, it would really help us to see you move actively on Israel-Palestine so that we would have some credibility in the broader Arab Muslim world for what is otherwise seen as a kind of sectarian revenge policy against the Shia and the Iranians. And would the Israelis, in return for getting access to better relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, some of the Gulf countries, be willing to make the kind of concessions that they have not been willing to make up until now? For example, on Jerusalem, or the 1967 borders, or return of refugees. Well, I think on both counts, this doesn't hold up. I don't think that the Saudis and the UAE are placing the Palestine issue very high up in their own priorities. I have been told by one person who's quite close to this administration that when Mohammed bin Salman or Mohammed bin Nahyan or whoever the interlocutors are come to Washington and talk confidentially with the president and his closest advisors, Palestine is not on the agenda. It's Iran, 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 and perhaps Syria. So if they're not hearing it from their best friends in the Arab-Sunni world, and they're not going to be hearing it from many others in the region because they're not listening to them, and the Israelis, for their own self-interested reasons, don't see that good relations out in the open with the Saudis and the UAE are better than under-the-table relations, Israelis are not going to move. They are getting the benefits already of these new relationships without having to pay any price. So I end up concluding that Nadia's right. Don't count on the Trump administration to go beyond some rhetoric. You may see a little bit more talk about this is such a great deal and we've got to get out there and promote it. But quite frankly, the person who's been charged with that, I think Jared Kushner has a little bit else on his mind right now, like running the entire government, but also surviving. So I'm not really convinced that we're going to get very far down the road. And even if Trump surprises us and says, you know, I really meant it. I want to be the ultimate deal maker, and I'm going to invest some serious time and energy in this. First, his attention span is like minuscule. I can't imagine he's going to spend the kind of time in it. It's hard work. Even when, you know, most of our efforts on this issue fail. But even those efforts have taken a huge amount of time and effort and still fail. Now, to succeed, to think that you can invest less and get a bigger outcome, I just don't see it. If the United States is going to play an important role in this, it is hard work. It requires a network of relations with a lot of different players to get this right. And it requires using a huge amount of political capital, which I don't think this administration has. You would have to have confidence that you could make the case to the American public, which I think the American public is less blinkered on this than people in Congress, for example. But you would have to say that this is why this matters compared to all the other issues that we confront in the world. And then you would have to convince Congress that the blank check that we have been giving to Israel over the years has to be reconsidered. And all of a sudden, we would see a miracle in American politics. The totally dysfunctional Congress that we have that cannot agree on anything would agree that this is a step too far. We cannot pull the plug on aid to Israel, even though Israel's GDP is now equivalent to most European countries. We still provide an enormous economic subsidy to a very rich country. Most Americans who would be presented with this, do you think that's reasonable? Do we think this should go on forever? Would probably say no, but 99% of the people in Congress would say yes, it should. And we know why. And until those kinds of fundamentals change, you're not going to ultimately have the capacity, even if the president thought he wanted to do something, to make American influence felt on Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. So yes, Nadia, you're right. Don't count on the United States in the coming years. And we probably also should listen to all the other speakers. It's time to be rethinking how we might envisage a way out of this incredible, unjust situation of 50 years of occupation. I'm probably the only one on the panel that remembers when it started. I was a graduate student in Algiers the day the war started. I hadn't spent any time thinking about the Palestine issue. I was a Maghreb specialist, and I didn't know much about this other part of the Arab world. And on the second day of the war, the Algerians were in the street demonstrating in support, not of Nasser, but of the Palestinians. Because Nasser had just lost the war and had embarrassed it. And all of a sudden I said, I think my next project is going to be to try to understand how the Palestinian issue can resonate thousands of miles away in another Arab country that I thought I knew pretty well. And all of a sudden, people are in the streets over this issue. So for the last 50 years, I've actually spent a lot of time on this, and it's been very frustrating and very disheartening. But I'm glad to know that there's a whole new generation coming along with new ideas and new approaches, and good luck to them.
Thank you very much, Bill. With that, I just want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions, and we are going to move to the Q&A session. And again, questions, if you could just jot them down on the note card and pass them along to the volunteers here who could bring them up. We'd really appreciate it. While we do that, I just want to address a couple questions here to get us started. And, you know, Bill, let me ask you, because you kind of began to talk about this. You know, you said if there is a strategy, and we may be starting to see it come together now with this idea of trying to bring certain Sunni states together with the Israelis, although we don't really know if that's the case. But if anything is going on, perhaps it's that. So, when you look at the Israelis, you look at the Saudis as well, it's clear that they've really taken quite a leap of faith in investing in the Trump presidency. They've bought in, and it seems like that's mutual. Aren't the players in the region also looking at this White House, the domestic situation here in the United States, and also wondering if they can count on President Trump?
Well, if they're reading the newspapers and paying attention, they should be. But, if they don't have Trump, they'll have Pence. And if they don't have Pence, they'll have Congress. I mean, for the Israelis, there's not much to lose. And quite frankly, for the Saudis have also done a remarkable job of convincing a lot of people, Saudis in the UAE, in official Washington, that they are on their way toward a kind of modernizing, reformist type of regime. It's a little hard for somebody who knows these places well to think of reformist and modernizing, yes, but reformist. But it's remarkable how well buying American public relations firms to give you, advice and economic reform plans works. All of a sudden you read the Saudi economic reform plan and say, wow, that really makes sense. Well, guess what? You buy those things and you've got enough money to do it, and it makes you look modern, and So I think the kind of policy realm has bought into the idea that we're dealing with a new Saudi Arabia, a kind of energized UAE with these young leaders who are going to be easier to work with than the old guys who were always kind of, stuck in a certain mindset. And that plus Israel, and I think, some of them had hoped maybe Turkey, but no longer so much with Turkey. And then Jordan and Egypt as kind of secondary players. Those are the key elements for remaking the Middle East. They still have this notion that, there's Syria to be fixed and there's, I guess, Iraq to be kind of settled. I don't know quite how that coalition helps in either of those places. But I do think that they've got their notion that these are the building blocks of the Middle East we want to deal with. And we have to accept some of their eccentricities of being monarchs and not letting women drive and not liking Houthis. Not that anybody in this administration knows who a Houthi is or cares. But that's the mindset as I see it. We've got 5 or 6 friends in the Middle East, and with them we can fix Syria, we can contain Iran, and we can back away from the unsuccessful projects of nation building and democratization that obsessed the previous 2 administrations.
Thank you for that. I want to move to the questions now from the audience. And this is addressed to the entire panel. What is to prevent the current situation, except much worse, from going on for another 50 years?
Not much.
I think one thing that we haven't seen a lot of lately is Palestinian initiative and agency. And so I do think that things can get worse, but things could potentially be arrested or even maybe changed through Palestinian initiative. And I think that would require a different kind of Palestinian leadership, one that is much more independent and much more representative and much more legitimate. And so one of the things that I would imagine is likely to happen over the next 50 years, and this doesn't require any real skill as far as future telling, but I think we're likely to see a different kind of leadership in the next half century. And it is when Palestinians take the initiative that I think things are likely to change diplomatically and politically. But as long as Palestinian leadership is sort of acquiescent in the current stagnation and inertia, then we're not likely to see any change.
I pile onto that by saying, initiative for what? I don't think there's any point in going on with the initiative as it's been shaped so far. And two things therefore stand in the way of it, with I fully agree in principle, but it's become rather abstract after 50 years. There's a reason why this leadership is so ineffectual. It's a leadership because it was installed as a leadership by Israel, which will tolerate no other kind of leadership. And until that leadership changes, we will see no such effective leadership. And I think, and that's a rather harsh thing to say, but why the hell not? That the PA was written in such a way as to reinstall Yasser Arafat as the president of a domestic, autonomous, proto-independent state, and it has turned into, with uncanny precision, a Bantustan. I really don't mean to harp on this as some kind of ideological drum at all. I lived in South Africa for 6 years and made a rather detailed study of the Bantustans, and when you come down to the exact writing up of the Oslo Accords, you find that it is almost word for word the constitutions of the Bantustans. I think there was some direct emulation there. So we have a Bantustan leadership, which is being set up to be one. And this bothers me when we talk about the Palestinians doing something, when people translate the Palestinians as the PA. I think that what we've seen, and I haven't been in the West Bank for a long time, and Gaza's kind of difficult now, and I don't think I'm allowed into the country anyway now. But my sense is that Palestinians are getting fed up, and that the PA is losing credibility by the day. There's presently no clear strategy to replace it with anything. I do, though, want to say one quick thing about what Nadia was saying about, accepting Israel as a legitimate state. A finding of apartheid delegitimizes Israel as a Jewish state. It doesn't delegitimize Israel any more than the finding of apartheid in South Africa delegitimized South Africa. But in the sense that this is a regime that is set up to dominate Palestinians in order to preserve the domination of another group, which is what Israel does in basic law very openly. It's codified, it's in oral statements, all of that. There's no question about that Israel's committed openly to being a Jewish state. The way that that's implemented on the ground fits the definition of apartheid. Now, when we actually look at that legal finding, and I'm not a lawyer, and Richard Falk is not a lawyer, it would have to be coming from authority way higher than us before people should rightly take it that seriously, but I think the evidence is overwhelming. That what we're looking at is a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift is not merely tootling the edges of the two-state solution and some kind of, and I look forward to a nice conversation over non-alcoholic beverages about confederation. I have a lot of problems with that, but I think it's a very interesting idea, and I'd like to hammer at it. But I think what we're doing when we say something like confederation is saying ethnic governance is okay. We accept that one of these states is going to be a state of ethnic supremacy and domination, because that's the only rationale for doing something like that. And that flies in the face of international human rights law. Now, how are we going to reconcile that? And it's through looking that hard in the face that a new paradigm must arise. We must deal with the situation as we understand it now. We can't simply try to improve the two-state solution as though this is not the case, as though we are not endorsing an apartheid state, because that is what it amounts to. The contradictions of trying to find a stable peace with an apartheid state are obvious. It can't be done. I also would point out that several Israeli leaders, Olmert and others, have said that when the Palestinians take this on as an anti-apartheid struggle, Israel is done for. Because they know it's an apartheid state. They know that by challenging the basic premises of Israel, the Palestinians would be developing a much more universal campaign, a much more persuasive campaign. And this fits with something I've often said, that if South Africa had been about establishing a Zulu state, we would have apartheid to this day. The way that the apartheid struggle in South Africa won was by making a claim on universal values and principles that everyone agreed with. It wasn't splitting it up and dividing it among the self-determination of all these people and allowing apartheid to subsist in some portion of the territory. The whole thing was understood to violate the basic rights of peoples and individuals to human rights. I do think that when we talk about a paradigm shift, we're talking about some pretty fundamental questions here. Nadia's rightly raised the question of how do you get there, but we can't even know how to get to someplace if we don't know where we're coming from.
I don't think we disagree on that. I certainly didn't say legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state. Just to be clear, I said that the challenge is to Israel's policies as they impact, the Palestinians, whether in Israel, under occupation, or as refugees. And just very briefly, on the next 50 years, I think that's becoming, I don't think you even have to wait 50 years for that. I think it's becoming increasingly clear now because of what Israel is doing to the West Bank, because that's drawing attention to how Israel itself was established at the beginning, and it's drawing attention to that amongst a very powerful constituency, which is, young Jews, many of them Americans, but elsewhere. So I think those are the trends that we're seeing that will question how you can have that kind of separation, as you say. But I don't see immediately a solution per se, whether in political terms, immediately on the horizon.
A question that we have from the audience is relevant to this discussion, and they ask, the white regime in South Africa came to the realization that grand apartheid had failed, and that was the legitimacy of the solution. What would convince the Israelis that the status quo is a failure? And I think it's a very pertinent question because to the Israelis right now, the status quo is preferable. They see that as preferable really to all other options. What is going to fundamentally change that calculation?
I'm sorry, the first part of it was that the South African regime changed its mind. I'm sorry, what was? Came
to realize that that grand apartheid had failed, and that undercut the legitimacy of the solution.
Well, they only decided that when the country became ungovernable. The streets, the country was in paralysis. The whole place was melting down through massive demonstrations and strikes. So let's get the sequence right here. They didn't decide, oh my goodness, it doesn't seem to be working, we'll have to undercut, I guess our system is wrong. They were confronting the collapse of the country, and the international boycott was really getting in their way. So it became, from a practical point of view, unworkable. And some of the experts in South Africa that I discussed this with when I was there talked about, that they had their own little aphorisms like, settler colonialism always follows the money. When you make it clear that they're going to make more money and it's going to be more stable and they're going to actually do better by giving this thing up, then they will. Now, that's a simplistic way of saying it, but I just want to be clear that it wasn't because the South African white regime made that decision that it then had, approached to this new enlightenment to enlightened self-interest to dismantle apartheid.
Just to sort of round out my previous answer on Palestinian leadership, and I think it also addresses this second question, because I do think that Palestinian initiative is kind of what's missing from this equation. And so when I refer to a Palestinian leadership, I'm not talking about the Muqata'a in Ramallah necessarily. I'm talking about leadership writ large, which means the body politic, the de facto authority in Gaza, which frankly has not been terribly effective itself, either at resistance or at governance. And both leaderships, in a sense, Hamas and Fatah, are really both have a share of responsibility in sustaining the status quo. They are part of the status quo. It is not only Israel. Obviously, there's the imbalance in power, and we have to account for that. Israel has more of a capacity to impose its will. But the current parties are participants, active, willing participants in the status quo. That doesn't mean Hamas has bought into Oslo, but they have acquiesced in certain realities to the effect that they have become essentially subcontractors of a different type in Gaza, performing the same type of role that the PA does in the West Bank. And so as long as we have this fragmented, incoherent, unstrategic Palestinian leadership, the status quo, I think, will continue. When you have a reformed leadership, that is not to say reforming the PA, sort of going back to the question I began with, do you revive or restore or reform, or do you simply replace? There are precedents for both. After the Great Revolt in 1936, for example, during the British Mandate, that revolt was not only directed at the British authorities, but also at their own ineffective leadership and sort of swept away that leadership. Who's to say that the next Palestinian uprising, if and when it does occur, might not reshape the nature of the Palestinian leadership itself? I think we are in that kind of a vacuum in terms of Palestinian leadership, that it is virtually a clean slate. But I don't see any, when Israel has a stake in maintaining the status quo and the United States has a stake in calm instability and not disrupting the status quo, as well as in accommodating Israeli needs, and the Arab states are so thoroughly distracted with other issues, it really does kind of fall to Palestinians at some stage to take matters into their own hands. May not come out for the better, but I don't see any change happening until that happens.
Khaled, let me ask you about that, because you make the point that the leaders are invested in the status quo. The leadership is invested in the status quo. But over time, it's not just the leaders and their personal interests, but also a structure itself that has become invested in the status quo, not just the individuals. So I wonder, do you think that kind of initiative for change can come from the inside?
The inside of the leadership or the inside of the Palestinian?
Inside of the West Bank and Gaza.
I think it's possible. I wouldn't rule it out entirely. I mean, other things, for example, the BDS movement did come from inside. On the other hand, we've seen the center of gravity in the Palestinian movement writ large shift at different moments, from the diaspora before 1988 to the occupied territories thereafter. And so who's to say that it might not shift again? And when we're talking about a paradigm shift, we're dealing, it might be a reformation of the PLO/PA. It might be to replace it entirely. I also see potential for a role among Palestinian citizens of Israel. I mean, it's very interesting and in a way ironic that the most dynamic sector of Palestinian politics is within the 1948, right? I mean, are Israeli citizens. And that is where I think a lot of young Palestinians in the occupied territories and elsewhere are beginning to look to people like Ayman Odeh or others for leadership. Not necessarily because they have some grand vision for one state, but simply because of the absence of any real credible leadership back home. And that applies, I think, equally to the West Bank and Gaza. So it's entirely possible that it could come out of the West Bank and Gaza. It could come out of Palestinians in Israel. It could come out of the diaspora. I can't say with certainty. But the trends seem to be, at least for now, and I don't necessarily have a reason for it, but for the moment, the most dynamic aspect of Palestinian politics appears to be beyond the PLO, beyond Hamas, and beyond the occupied territories.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to actually say,
Please,
say that I think we have to, we will not know now where the leadership will come from, because it will take different shapes to what it is now, and I don't see it coming out from the existing political leaderships in the, and it's going to be, I mean, it's a different world. There are new tools and technologies that could also influence the way leadership is done and managed and so on. But I mean, the interesting thing about the BDS movement, which came, as you say, from inside, is that it's successful because it's focused narrowly on a strategy, and it's not claiming leadership over the Palestinian people. It can't. And so there's no getting away from the fact that the Palestinian body politic is really stuck at the moment, you know, between a place where it can't die, the old can't die, and the new can't be born. And I totally agree that where there is space for movement, where there is space for action, specifically the Palestinian citizens of Israel, that is happening, that leadership is happening and being given. But don't think that Israel isn't aware of that as well, and is also cracking down, and will be cracking down even further on the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So I know there will always be a movement for Palestinian rights, but I can't at the moment imagine what its leadership would look like and how it would be shaped.
I have something to say, but I want to privilege the audience's questions.
Well, we have, since we've kind of talked about the alternative solutions, it was a theme throughout most of the conversations. There's a couple questions that I would string together here. The first really is clearly skeptical of the idea of an alternative to a two-state solution, and it asks, does anyone believe that there can ever be peace without the creation of a Palestinian state? That's addressed to the entire panel, and I would also ask that, Khaled, this question, which is related in terms of alternatives, asking you to expand on this notion of rights for security instead of land for peace. What would that look like?
Well, first, one of the problems I have with the idea of rights for peace is that you really can't have governance unless you have control of land. You have to be able to develop your land according to mission goals and needs of the society. You have to be able to control the water. You have to be able to build roads. You have to be able to support certain kind of agricultural zones, you know, the parts of the land that are appropriate for olives, the parts of the land that are appropriate for other kinds of crops. So the difference between the Jordan Valley and the West Bank Highlands, you can't have sovereignty or statehood without controlling land. So I find that is not really, if you talk about rights without land, control of land, coming out of the model we have now, it seems to me a formula for the same thing we have already, which is truncated rights given to Palestinians, which may have the trappings of democracy, such as the vote, but which neatly and tidily prevent them from changing any of the laws of the state that privilege Jewish rights over Palestinian rights. The other thing is that I do believe that there is no point in pursuing a state of Palestine, and it worries me greatly because I think everything we see in Israeli policy, in the imbalance of power, in the way things have gone so far, there's a bit of path dependency there, tell us that that state is going to be a Bantustan. And we have to remember that the Bantustans had parliament buildings, they had the trappings of democracy, they had ministries that handled local affairs, and they were all under the thumb of the plenary power of the dominant society, which was the white apartheid government. This was written into their constitutions through the operations of a minister, some uppercase minister who would determine whether any laws they passed were okay with the white apartheid government. That system, they promoted this as independence. 4 of these things were recognized by Israel, and I think a few other countries piled in to recognize some of the Bantustans as independent states before the whole international community threw up their hands and said this is a fraud and a fiction. And the ANC was saying this is a fraud and a fiction, and we don't want anyone to support this because it's a lie, and our true leadership is all on Robben Island and needs to be released because that's who really represents us. The other thing is that when you look at the geography of the situation, where is this state going to be? In the best case scenario, you reunify the West Bank, and you have 2 major cantons of the West Bank and Gaza Strip with some kind of corridor running through to connect them and to create a splotch of influence or autonomy or something in East Jerusalem. This is an unworkable formula. It would be unworkable in any study of viability that you could come up with. We don't see anything like that emerging now. The West Bank is thoroughly broken up by settlements and their infrastructure. It's those famous maps with showing this little archipelago of spots is where we're going with this. There is nothing on the international stage to suggest that anyone is going to change that. There was a very interesting article that came out recently that finally clarified the powerful ideological commitment that Israel has to retaining the West Bank. These are the lands of Jewish mytho-history, and it's not going to be different. I think, I realize I'm taking too much time here, but I just want to end by saying a statehood under these circumstances being so fraught as to be an ugly-looking trap, the only way out of that is to dissolve the Green Line. The only way out of that is to look at how Israel is actually applying and operating its apartheid regime, which depends on defining certain portions of the land under different legal regimes. That's how the Palestinian politics are debilitated. When you mandate Palestine on its original design, it was all supposed to be one country. And when that difference between the Palestinians, I could not more strongly endorse your point about the Palestinian citizens of Israel. When they stop being seen as the others, the sellouts, there's a big ideological difference there. When that starts to break down and the fundamental condition of Jewish national dominance over Palestinian national affairs is confronted for what it is, which looks like apartheid. I mean, the only reason I hesitate is because I'm waiting for the ICJ to say so, and not just me and Richard. But I think any of you looking at it carefully would come up with the same conclusion. Once that is dissolved, once the Green Line is dissolved, then you have the makings of a new set of options. And the state of Palestine would become the state it was supposed to be. This is cutting edge stuff, but as Thomas Kuhn pointed out, paradigm shifts don't happen overnight. They're incremental. They start out with a bunch of intellectuals around a coffee table, and then they spin from there. But I think it's inevitable. That
or in a hotel ballroom.
Yes, hotel ballrooms. Yeah, eggheads talking to each other, yeah.
Are there any more questions?
So there's one more I want to get to. I want to give Khaled a brief opportunity, if you could, because the question on the rights for security was addressed to you originally. So if you could briefly.
Yeah. Before I do, just on the question that was asked, does anyone believe peace is possible without a Palestinian state? I'm not arguing against a Palestinian state. I'm arguing for reimagining a Palestinian state beyond our very kind of blindered view of straight partition. There's a hard border. You're over here. You're over there. That has never worked. Every single partition plan on paper has failed. And so what I'm saying is that it is possible to imagine. It takes a lot of work and a lot of creativity, and a lot of strategic thinking, all of which are currently absent in Israel, among the Palestinian leadership, and certainly here in Washington. And so I think it is possible to imagine two separate sovereign states, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, but where you have a more sort of blurry understanding of sovereignty or of the borders, where there would be access. For example, returning refugees might, the idea of confederation isn't that it is a set model, but that it opens up a new toolbox of tools that could be used in addressing these very, very difficult issues. So for example, the issue of refugees, instead of simply saying X number can return, X number, the vast majority, cannot, you could have a situation where Palestinian refugees return, are granted citizenship in a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, but could have residency rights or visitation rights to their former villages and homes in Israel. Obviously, this requires a very different kind of psychology that doesn't exist. But what I'm saying is that I don't think it's possible to simply erase the green line for one simple reason. It's not just that the two sides have a yearning for self-determination, have a right for self-determination, but simply dissolving the border doesn't address the issue of national self-expression. You have today Israeli nationalism, you have Zionist narrative and ideology, and you also have very clear Palestinian national movement that has a very strong identity, that has its historical national narrative. And the idea of a melded identity, and I've seen proposals for this. There's one called Palesra, for a new identity to be forged in a sort of shared Jewish-Arab identity. I don't see that happening. I think that's much harder to create than to simply build on what you currently have, as imperfect as the realities are. But what I'm arguing for is to use a new set of tools in order to take the very inequitable situation that you have and make it more equitable without necessarily, so it's partition without separation necessarily, in a sense. So I'm arguing for being more creative than the Clinton parameters, which have been on the table now for 17 years and are completely defunct and have been overtaken by events. That's the thrust of what I'm arguing. As far as rights for security, I meant that kind of just as an example. If you boil down each side to its fundamental ask or need or interest, for the Israelis, it is security. That is the overriding lens through which Israelis view everything. And for Palestinians, the narrative is really very much about rights, a restoration of whether it's refugee rights or the right to self-determination or civil rights, equal rights in an Israeli state, whatever the discourse is, it is about rights. And if we reframe the conversation instead of the narrow, within the narrow confines of simply land for peace to something broader, what Israelis want is security, what Palestinians want is rights. Security and rights can be achieved in different ways. So it doesn't preclude the possibility of a one-state solution or some sort of confederation or even partition. I think there is a way to satisfy rights and security, but we also have to be cognizant of the fact that we can't erase the histories of two very different national movements or somehow artificially merge them. I think that's just not realistic.
Thank you, Khaled. Well, clearly, there's plenty more discussion that needs to be had about alternative solutions and pathways moving forward. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time for today, but I want to thank everybody on this panel for their contributions today, and for everyone in the audience for coming and for the important questions that were asked. Thank you very much.